Hey, how you doing? We're going to have a short video of our dual notes, and we're going to have a quick talk about the reform movement. And I know in history we can talk about reform being a lot of different things during a lot of different time periods, but we're going to focus mainly on the early 1800s and how that progressed into other things. Now, you may know something about something called the Great Awakening. I don't know if that makes any sense to you at all. But the Great Awakening was this religious movement that happened in the early 1800s that enabled people to want to go out and do things and change society. Specifically, people who bought into the Great Awakening believed that they could be saved through good works. And I know that kind of sounds a lot like other religions. Maybe I know the Catholic religion, I know Hinduism and Buddhism talk about karma and doing good things coming back to you, that type of stuff. I don't want to get into all that. Whether you believe or don't believe in religion is irrelevant. What really matters is that those beliefs inspired a lot of things that would eventually change and still have an impact on our society today. But let's go back and look at our paper, because we're gonna build a piece of paper here, and we're not going to do any folds. We're going to focus on our fingertips. And right here in the upper left hand corner, get your paper landscape style. We're going to build something here. And you are going to use about the width of your hand, and see where I use my finger at the first knuckle. I'm going to, right about there, I'm going to draw a dot. I'm going to come over here and do the same thing. I'm going to stop right here at the fingertip. I'm going to draw right there at the knuckle. And then I'm going to connect the dots. I'm going to do it with a big arc. Oh, I missed my arc. That's a terrible looking arc. That's okay, it won't hurt anything. Normally I just don't miss the dot, but you know what? Today I did. And just means my umbrella has got a little extra slope to it. Because that's what we're drawing an umbrella, because we're going to use this umbrella symbology to explain the reform movement during this time period and all the things that would have fallen under the umbrella of the term. And an umbrella wouldn't be an umbrella without a handle. Now you can color that handle if you want to, or if you don't worry about it. It doesn't matter. But I'm going to add a little color just because I love color. Okay. Now, let's talk about what's on our umbrella. Reform movements. And we're going to talk about the 1800s, 1860, and beyond. I probably shouldn't have put the apostrophe S there. That's okay. Don't tell anybody. Okay, the reform movements, 1800s to 1860s, approximately. But I put this arrow up here because they didn't stop during this time period. They kept going in one shape or form. But we're just going to talk briefly about some of these movements that popped up, and we might be able to make some modern day connections to what's going on now, or what you know in society as you live it today. So the very first thing, and I always ask my students this: if you could end women's suffrage, would you do it? Think about that for a second. Wouldn't it be wonderful to end women's suffrage all around the world? Why should suffrage be an issue that women have to deal with? Now, somebody in the class usually picks up on the fact that they shouldn't vote for this, because women's suffrage is really talking about a fundamental right, the right to vote. And women weren't always guaranteed the right to vote. You know, in 1700s France, which, to be honest with you, that enlightened time period is really what kind of inspired much of what we did in our country when we declared independence. Much of the salons and stuff, these people would stop. They would never talk in complicated ways in front of women because that was impolite. Women didn't have the brain capacity to handle the difficult concepts of politics, let alone giving them, oh my goodness, the right to vote. Yes, so women's suffrage was a very, very controversial thing amongst a lot of men. But women, they started picking up steam. They started saying, wait a second, if you're going to have us raise these kids and these young men to become fine young leaders of our grand new republic, shouldn't we have the right to have a say in what's going on in that world? Shouldn't we have a right to be able to vote for people who are going to help move forward a society that's going to help these kids grow and become the next leaders of our country? Well, they had a pretty strong argument. Did it work? Eventually, women wouldn't get the right to vote until the 19th Amendment, which didn't happen until about 1920. So it took a long time, but definitely there were some states that bought into it earlier than others. And some states, I believe Wyoming was the first state to allow women to be able to vote. Another reform movement that we can talk about, which is probably the favorite of every single student in school, is something called public education. Now, if you don't know what public education is, well, you might be sitting in the middle of it if you're watching this video. Public education is the idea of having universal education available for all people, all students. And maybe not initially people of color, maybe not initially boys and girls both, but reality, it comes down to giving people an opportunity to learn how to read and write and progress and learn and maybe even create new opportunities for them. Early on, schools were available, but they're usually only available for wealthy people. And the idea that we could create a public school system that would educate everybody up to a certain age, number one, would keep kids from running around the streets and messing around and doing things to get in trouble, but also would help us become a more educated society and would allow people the base of knowledge they needed to go on and do other things. Being able to read and write is a pretty fundamental skill that we have in society nowadays, but it wasn't a guaranteed right. Right around the 1830s, Massachusetts, the state of Massachusetts, was the first state to initiate a public school system, and eventually all states would follow. This is something that would probably hit home to my dad, because my dad was a laborer. Well, he was kind of a mechanic, but he worked for a union, and a union was designed to protect the rights of workers. And when we talk about laborers, sometimes we see laborers on construction sites or in factories. These are people who labor all day long. That's their job. When you go into a job, there's certain protections for you now. For instance, you have to be what age to be able to work? Well, 14, exactly. You want to work more than 8 hours? Well, you're entitled to some sort of compensation pay. If you are working 8 hours, you're entitled to a break. You're entitled to lunch. You're entitled to things. If there is a faulty wiring in your walls and the exposed wiring from an outlet, you can call an organization called OSHA, which will come in there and they'll investigate, and because their entire purpose is to make sure you have a safe work environment. If you get hurt in the job, there's things called workers' compensation. There's all kinds of different things that we can tie to the modern day labor movement. But back then, none of those things were being addressed. There were no protections for people. There were no safeguards. There was no net in case you stumbled in life. If you had somebody who died in your family, or you were sick, or something disastrous happened, it didn't matter. You better be at work or you're going to lose your job. You worked the number of hours you worked. If they didn't like something you're doing, they could dock your pay. Work conditions were usually pretty miserable. They didn't have to let you stop and eat. All these things happened, and they were miserable, miserable work environments for many, many years. And it took a lot of work to get some of those rights. Some of those rights didn't come until the mid-1900s. So this has been an ongoing battle for many years. But when we talk about the reform movements of this time period, We got to stop and we got to look at the labor movement as being one of those movements that, well, it was at least having discussions. It didn't get a lot of power, didn't take off like it did later on, but it was still part of the reform movements of this time period. Hey, and by the way, if you want to have a little color here, that's a hammer. By the way, I don't want to confuse anybody. Sometimes my artwork's so simple that people get confused by it. That's a hammer. That's actually kind of a tack hammer. Okay. Another one. Now, some of the same people who are championing public education were also really worried about mental illness reform. And it's not like we had a lot of programs out there, or there were any good medications to help people, or there were psychiatrists. Psychiatry was still an evolving, wasn't even something that had been really developed at this time period. Typically, when somebody had a mental illness, the solution to handling those people would be to throw them in jail. And I don't know about you, but if you've ever dealt with mental illness, you know putting somebody in a cell, dark, isolated, no sunlight, no fresh air, poor nutrition, and treating them like a criminal doesn't really make their mental state better. It actually has a huge negative impact on those individuals. And there were no treatments available for folks like that. If they were somebody who was deemed mentally unfit, they would literally just throw them away. And our prisons nowadays are filled with people who have mental health issues, but even those mental health issues in there are they try to treat them as they can. They're aware of them, and the conditions are far more humane than anything that would have been developed at this time. So mental illness reform was something that was out there and a very passionate project for some people. Now, maybe you've heard of this, maybe you haven't, but it's something called the temperance movement. If you don't know what temperance is, don't worry, most people don't. Let's see if you guys can follow along and draw one of these dudes. You want to guess what that is? That's right, it's a bottle. It's a bottle of booze. Yeah, temperance was the effort to get rid of alcohol. And there were people, especially people who were of religion, who were dead set against the idea of alcohol being legalized because they believed alcohol caused many of the social ills or problems that people dealt with in society. Let me paint a picture for you. A guy gets paid. Instead of going home to his family, he goes out to the bar and has a few drinks. And then he has a few more drinks. And he buys his buddies some drinks. And then he starts to gamble that money off to some in a card game or something like that. And then maybe he decides to go off with his buddies and they go to a place of ill repute and spending money on things they really shouldn't spend money on. What's left over for the family? You know, that guy comes home, he gets frustrated because he's got no money, he can't pay his bills, maybe he becomes abusive to his family, his wife, his kids. What's the cause? Alcohol. So if you can get rid of alcohol, you can get rid of a lot of the problems that are happening in our society. A lot of these other things that are causing issues in terms of financial hardship or you know, the tough living environments for children and things like that, and get rid of alcohol, that'll solve the problem. Here's my question for you. Did it work? Well, yes, it did actually work. It worked in the sense that eventually, well, some states actually outlawed alcohol. There are some states and some counties and some areas that put heavy restrictions on it, or they're still considered dry counties where you can't buy alcohol in those places, or you can't buy them on certain days. In our country, there was actually an amendment that was put in place, passed by our Congress, saying all sale, manufacture, and distribution of alcohol was illegal in this country. And it lasted for, well, for quite a while, over a decade. Eventually, they realized it wasn't working, and they passed another amendment, the 21st Amendment, to get rid of prohibition altogether. But during that time period, people found a way to drink. They formed like secret speakeasies and bars. This is like the Roaring '20s, the 1900s. This is when the organized crime was in the movies, and they're out stealing from each other and bootlegging and all these things. Well, this is all tied to the temperance movement, and temperance was something that grew and grew and grew over years, and finally hit its stride when it came to the 1900s. And they realized that it wasn't working very well because they backed up. But there are still pieces of this around here. Number one, you got to be a certain age to buy alcohol. There are drinking and driving laws in place. There are restrictions on who can sell alcohol. So the temperance movement, even though we didn't outlaw alcohol, has still made a pretty big impact on society, and it's put limits on who can get it and when they can get it in our country. Okay. Here's the last movement I'm going to bring up here. And there may be other things. We're just going to focus on 6. And this is one that kind of dominates this time period we're talking about. Do you know what abolition is? Well, let's see if this will help you. Now what am I saying? That's right. This is the effort to get rid of slavery. And I can tell you right now that not everybody was on board with this because a lot of people just didn't care. It didn't affect them. And obviously in your South, you were dead set against it because now you felt like somebody's coming after your way of life. Abolition was a movement that had to grow over time. And there were certain things in history, maybe you'll talk about some other time, hopefully you will, like the Dred Scott case and the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 and Uncle Tom's Cabin and John Brown's rape, things that really brought slavery home to a lot more people in the North and made it much more of a real topic for them. But abolition was in many ways started by some of the people's religious beliefs that how can you live in a society where other people are forced to be slaves or owned by other people? And they didn't think it was Christian. They didn't think it was good for our country, and they definitely didn't think it was something that their interpretation of God wanted. So abolition is a growing movement. It's part of this reform effort that falls under this umbrella during this time period. Now, if you want to color your umbrella, you can. But I'm going to add a little green to it. And the reason I'm going to add a little green to it is this. Because I think this umbrella represents growth. And growth comes from change. Growth comes from reflection. Growth comes from reassessing the kind of world we want to be in and the kind of people we want to be. And during the 1800s, our country is going through an identity battle that would result in us having to go to war and determine exactly what kind of country we're going to be. So here's what we got here: women's suffrage, public education, labor conditions, mental illness reform, temperance, abolition, and there's more things we could go into. We're going to focus on those 6. I hope this helped you out. And if you have any questions, obviously you always have access to the internet. You can use your Google machine to look up about anything these days, but maybe talk to a teacher, talk to an adult, or do something really crazy. Go to your library and check out a book. Oh my, I know that's a big one. Okay, that's it. Thank you and good luck.